Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us again for another Sakura webinar. Today we are very thankful to have Kelly Dijak to present for us today. Her presentation is titled Histology Best Practices for CLIA Regulation Compliance. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it right over to Kelly. Good morning, Kelly, and take it away.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Kelly Dijak, and I am very pleased to be able to speak to you this afternoon on a topic in which I take great pride in coaching laboratory professionals. To give you a little bit of my background, I have spent my entire career in the laboratory, starting about 28 years ago as a cytotechnologist fresh out of school. After a few years, my interest grew in the field of histology, and one of the histotechs in our anatomic pathology department took me under her wing and taught me the skills I needed to be successful. Eventually, I was able to sit for the histology certification exam. After a few years, I took interest in the quality, regulatory, and compliance worlds for the general laboratory. At the same time, I began assuming a more technical advisory role for the AP departments as my hospital merged with others and we became a system laboratory. In doing so, I became intrigued with ways to use a lot of the guiding principles geared towards the clinical lab as tools in the anatomic pathology department in order to make it one of the best in our region. So with that in mind, the agenda for the presentation this afternoon will include the following items in relation to CLIA regulation compliance. We'll talk about training and competency as it relates to the histology department. We'll discuss document control and the process that surrounds this compliance. We'll talk about histology improvement, including quality monitoring and proficiency testing documentation. And then finally, we'll touch upon personnel educational qualifications, CLIA roles, and the responsibilities associated with those roles. We will begin today's presentation discussing training and competency. Training and competency is a critical element of every laboratory department. A compliant training and competency program consists of several stages: initial training, initial competency, 6-month competency, and then finally your annual competency. So the first step in setting up an effective training and competency program is identifying test systems within the department. Test systems are used to organize your training and competency into sections so that you can further define how you are going to conduct your training and subsequent competency. Test systems are defined as groups of tests that can be trained and competencied together as one unit. From a testing standpoint, the guiding principle is that everything you are considering to be in a single test system is such that they can all be trained and competencied utilizing the same process. So if you demonstrate one test and are successful, you can technically perform them all. So for example, if you are trained and can show competency of performing AE1, AE3 on Stainer X, and all IHC are considered the same test system, then you can essentially do all IHC on Stainer X. There is not a need to train in competency every single IHC that you might perform on Stainer X. The clinical lab is pretty straightforward when it comes to defining test systems because they are so much more automated and pretty much everything that is performed on instrumentation or by utilizing a kit. But I have found using the same concept in the histology department is very effective. So let's talk about ideas for test systems within the histology department. Some suggestions for test systems in histology would be specimen preparation, routine H&E processing, IHC processing, and special stain processing, as you can see indicated here at the top of the slide. As mentioned, in the clinical departments, test system definitions are usually driven by the instrument or kit in which a particular test is being performed. For histology, we can apply that concept to IHC and special stains. However, we have to think out of the box a bit to apply this concept to the other areas in histology that are relevant, such as cutting and embedding, and all the other sort of miscellaneous tasks we carry out in the department. You can see on this slide how each of the aforementioned test systems are essentially defined. So specimen preparation can kind of be a catch-all, if you will, that would include things like accessioning specimens, preparing consultations, sending out specimens to a referral laboratory, FNA and frozen section assistance in specimen preparation, and then the decal process. Routine H&E processing could include things like tissue processing, embedding, microtomy, and then the routine H&E staining, kind of that whole sort of, generic process that occurs within the department. And then IHC and special stain processing are separate test systems. However, how a lab handles competency on these test systems might depend on whether the lab performs these stains manually or on an instrument. When performed on an instrument, all stains can be handled as a single test system, IHC being one and then special stains being the other. If performed manually, however, you will need to look at those procedures and determine how you can most appropriately assess competency. So once you have determined what test systems you need to address within the department, you need to decide who in your department can train in competency. While training is very important, the more critical role is the staff members that are delegated the competency responsibility. Training can be performed by either members of your staff or by companies from which you buy instruments or test kits. The initial competency that is performed is done to substantiate the training. So you want to make sure that the person or people in this role are ones you can depend on to ensure training was successful. In order to ensure that each stage is successfully completed, it is important to identify and formally document which staff are delegated the tasks of training and competency. Staff with these responsibilities should have appropriate qualifications, such as predetermined number of years of experience in the area, a particular certification, formal training by a vendor where they actually went on site somewhere, or other things of that nature. A solid training program is the first step in the successful onboarding of new employees. Training is the process we use to demonstrate all tasks and responsibilities within the department. Training should be approached by each defined test system. This helps the new employee to organize the expectations that you will have of them within the department. Competency is different from training, and it's really important to understand what the difference is. Competency is described as a set of defined behaviors that provide a structured guide enabling the identification, evaluation, and development of the behaviors in individual employees. Competency is critical because it ensures that the employee has been trained appropriately and that they understood the training that they were given. It essentially confirms that the employee has the tools and the ability to do a job properly. So in short, training is showing someone what to do, and then competency is ensuring that they can actually perform the task on their own and that they are able to do what they were shown. Once an employee has been trained on a particular test system, it is good practice to perform an initial competency on the employee for that test system. Initial competency is used to determine the effectiveness of training, as well as the person's readiness to function in his or her actual work environment. As a matter of note, initial training and initial competency should not only be performed for new employees, but also when new test systems are introduced into the department. When new test systems are introduced, the process starts from the beginning where you conduct training and then perform an initial competency at the time the new test system is brought into the department. So for example, if your department is bringing in next-gen sequencing for the first time, this would be considered a new test system regardless of the longevity of the employees, and all employees then would go through that initial training followed by an initial competency sequence. So once the initial competency phase has been completed, then you move into the ongoing competency phases. Ongoing competencies should be performed to make sure that employees continue to perform their jobs to the expectation of leadership. So new employees are required to have competency performed in the first 6 months and then again at a year. And then after that, these employees are competencied on an annual basis. As I mentioned, new test systems also follow that same track. So they will do a repeat competency required at 6 months after it's introduced, and then again at a year, and then annually thereafter. It is important to note here that ongoing competency should not be confused with the performance evaluation that is conducted for the organization generally on an annual basis. While ongoing competency or lack thereof should be reflected in the performance evaluation, the performance evaluation is not a replacement of formal competency assessment. A key component of an effective competency program are the steps taken when competency has not been met. What do you do when you competency a staff member and it's evident that they cannot perform the process or they miss critical steps in the process? It's important to have good documentation when an employee has failed to demonstrate competency. What did you do to re-educate the employee? Did you request that they read policies and procedures to freshen up on the content? Did you have them shadow another employee on the process? Did you give them material to review? Once the re-education is complete, you must recompetency them on the test system to make sure that the education was then effective. Most of the time, these are the kinds of remediation that are likely to be performed. Usually the employee just misses certain steps or doesn't perform the process exactly as they should. Although it doesn't happen often, there are times when employees must be removed from performing a particular test system because they have not demonstrated their competence in doing so. And it is more significant than just missing a step. In these situations, the employee must really start the process over as if they were a new employee. They must complete a training cycle and then a competency cycle again. As deemed appropriate by individual organizations, this kind of documentation is then utilized in the performance evaluation to determine things like merit increases or even continued employment within the organization. So in order to develop a competency, you need to know and understand the elements of competency that CLIA outlines in the regulation. There are 6 elements of compliance according to CLIA. This means that there are 6 means to an end, if you will, in assessing an employee's competence. All elements must be utilized in a competency assessment unless they cannot be applied. So the elements include, and are indicated on this slide, direct observation of various tasks associated with the test system, monitoring the recording and reporting of test results, review of intermediate records, direct observation of performance of instrument maintenance and function checks, assessment of test performance through blind samples, and then the last one is assessment of problem-solving skills. So there are 4 overarching components to developing a competency for each test system. So for each test system, once those have been identified, You must then identify available learning activities, determine the method of evaluation for each of those learning activities, and then ensure that there is a timestamp of competency and document the identification of the evaluator, and then finally ensure that there is an assessment performed by both the evaluator and a member of leadership. We'll go through each of these items in the next couple of slides here. So once you determine your test systems and who in your department will be responsible for these tasks, the next step is to determine what activities you are going to have the employees perform in each of the 6 CLIA categories. Some CLIA categories cannot be assessed for some test systems. It just doesn't make sense to do that, or it might not apply. For example, it makes sense to use a blind sample for something like your IHC or special stains, but it doesn't make sense to use a blind sample for something like cutting or embedding. Each test system should be assessed for the applicability of each of the CLIA categories and a decision made as to what activities are going to be used to assess each category. For example, for test system A, if you decide that it is an important part of the process that the employee completes intermediate records appropriately, then that should be a learning activity that is included. Then you need to further define that and decide which intermediate records are you going to assess to determine competency. Once the activities have been determined and defined, you will need to decide how that activity will be conducted in order to determine whether the staff member is competent. So for test system A again, if you evaluate the review of intermediate records, which is CLIA element number 3, you need to decide how you are going to do this. If you decide you are going to use the appropriate completion of QC records or data entered into the LIS that are considered part of the activity to evaluate intermediate records, how do you plan to do this? Will it be a verbal activity where you ask the employee how they complete these? Or will it be a document data review where you actually pull the documents and review the hard copies and make sure that they were completed appropriately and that the task was completed appropriately? Using everyday activities is generally much better in terms of assessing competency. You want to do this as much as possible in order to be as efficient as possible in getting your competency completed. You want to use as many routine activities that an employee may complete on a daily basis to substantiate competency. This will ease the burden of both the employee and the person assigned to assess competency. So if you know you review QC daily, then include that as part of your competency plan. Then when you do your review and you see that each staff member adequately completed their QC documentation, you can file this away to use as the documentation of competency for this particular element. So let's look at an example of a competency assessment. On this slide, you will see an example of a competency that has been completely built. It shows all of the test systems listed at the top, and then the CLIA elements listed down the left-hand side. And then the squares on the inside are the learning activities and the method of evaluation that are reflected for each one. The part that is not indicated on here are the last 2 components that were mentioned earlier and that are imperative for an effective competency program, and that is the documentation of the date that the competency was performed and who performed it. And then finally, the review of the histology leadership and medical director, again, doing that final review of the competency for the staff member. How this is performed definitely differs among organizations. Many organizations have electronic documentation of competency. Some do it all on paper, and some do a hybrid. It really doesn't matter how you do it, just that all the required elements are present. So in looking at the grid on the slide, just to kind of go through a couple of them and talk through a couple, if you look at the first test system, which is specimen preparation, you can see in the box directly below it the areas that are assessed via direct observation. So we've decided that direct observation is the way that is applicable for specimen preparation, and we will be doing direct observation of accessioning of specimens, sending out consultations and other cases, assistance on either FNAs, frozen sections, and then looking at decals and that endpoint verification of decal specimens. The NA that is indicated in the next box is not applicable because we don't feel there is no test results, so therefore there will be nothing that will be assessed for that particular element. Record review of intermediate records. For specimen preparation, we'll be looking at things like data entry within the LIS, review of QC results, instrument reports, review of records within the patient charts, like things that we know need to be documented in the patient chart as related to specimen accessioning, etc. The next item is direct observations of actual maintenance. We might look at this for daily maintenance, weekly maintenance, or monthly maintenance. And these usually are particular pieces of equipment or other kind of miscellaneous QC tasks that might be associated with that kind of specimen preparation assistance to the grossing person task. So it could be, temperature or humidity tracking. It could be the centrifuge, the QC that's associated with the centrifuge, refrigerator temperatures, that kind of thing. Proficiency testing, again, is not applicable for specimen preparation. Problem solving is something that we consistently do with every test system for all areas. And generally for problem solving, we will do either a quiz. We'll make a quiz where we look at either high risk, problem prone, high volume sort of issues that we know occur. We'll create a quiz, we'll assign the quiz, and then we'll grade the quiz in the end. So for specimen preparation, as well as the other test systems indicated here, that's kind of a common way that we address problem solving. So for the other three areas that are listed here, routine H&E processing, again, kind of the same things as far as what we do for each element. That direct observation is critical. We actually have a person who then, the person who's assigned to competency will watch someone go through the process of a case from the embedding to the microtomy and then to the slide verification piece after the H&E slides come off of the stainer. IHC special stains, again, much of the same. The one difference there is you'll see under the proficiency testing, we do have an indication there that we do utilize that element. And generally, we use our survey material for those elements, where we will assign them to different employees within the department. They will take the survey material, they'll run it through, and then we'll assess the results that they get at the end of the process. So this process of creating competency assessments should get repeated for every employee role in your department. So in the end, you should have a handful of predetermined competency assessments then, based on the roles you have within your department. These competency assessments then get assigned to the employees based on their role. So some examples of roles that are seen in the histology department are as follows on the slide. The histology technician, histotechnologist, usually those are kind of more or less interchangeable. Anatomic pathology support assistants, so those people who aren't necessarily the techs but do a lot of the support tasks, and then the PA. So the entire process then is completed based on the role of the employee and the competency assessments that have been created for each role. The process begins by completing training for each test system. Usually it is best to proceed one test system at a time. The process continues by performing the initial competency for each test system. Again, it's best to proceed one test system at a time. So what you basically do then is you train a test system, then competency that test system, train the next test system, and then competency that next test system, and so on and so forth. So we can go through a couple examples here of competency profiles. So this is the HT-HTL competency of IHC test system. So the competency events are listed in the left-hand column with the learning activity in the middle and then the method of evaluation in the far right. So for the first competency event, it's truly the proper processing of IHC. So our staff member who is assigned to do competency for that test system will, via direct observation, they will watch the staff member who is being competency demonstrate that they can properly take an IHC stain through the entire process. And then subsequent to that, then they will look at intermediate records. And in this example, they'll look at different data entry points in the LIS, and they'll review daily QC. And we've decided that that is going to be more of a document sort of retrospective review. Completing maintenance is always a direct observation for us. We have, again, the person who's assigned competency will directly observe the staff member as they go through the maintenance processes. Assessment of test performance. This again is one where we will give them a blind sample, and they on their own then will take that sample through the testing process and then submit it for evaluation. And then the last piece here is, again, that problem solving. So we will assign them a quiz to complete, and then we will grade that quiz and then give them feedback on that quiz and decide if there are things that we need to do further as far as either re-education or give them other resources that they might need to read if we feel like there's some areas where they may be weak on. The next example is a support assistant competency of the specimen preparation test system. So again, you can see here more specifically the areas that we look at, and then the learning activities that have been chosen, and then again, that method of evaluation. And then the last example I have is the pathology assistant. The competency of a pathology assistant is oftentimes, we do it hand in hand with the pathologists themselves, particularly when it comes to the proper gross dissection. So again, this is a direct observation of the demonstration of the gross dissection by the pathology assistant. And generally a pathologist will participate in this as well to ensure that the PAs are doing their dissection as per our policy. We will do a lot of the same things with them as far as review of intermediate records, so LIS data entry or review of daily QC. We will observe them performing their maintenance, whether that's the daily, weekly, or monthly maintenance that might be assigned to them. And then finally, again, the quiz assessment that is then assigned to them. So now we're going to move into the concept of document control. Document control can be a very involved process depending on how big your organization or system is and how many documents you have to control. Document control is a process that is exactly as it suggests. It is essentially a method of control of all document types in every stage of a document's life cycle. It ensures that we are always using a current version of a document. Additionally, it is a mechanism to track all changes that have ever been made to a document, including when they occurred. Changes to a document should be tracked on an ongoing basis, including the archival or retirement of the document. This is important in the life cycle of a document, so you know you can always determine exactly what version of a document you had in place at any particular point in time, and you can tell when edits were made and what exactly the edit was. Document control processes also assist in the facilitation of securing of appropriate sign-off on all documents prior to implementation. Document control can be performed either via an electronic system or via a manual process. The standard doesn't change whether it's manually or electronically controlled, but obviously the process is far easier with an electronic system. Document control applies to a variety of documents, including all policies and procedures, all forms, quality management documents, safety documents, and quality control documents, to name a few. Essentially, all documents where there needs to be a tracking mechanism for changes made and/or an assurance that the current version of the document is in place should be maintained within a document control program. This does not apply to documents like static reports, such as year-end exposure reports that are showing a snapshot in time, or resource materials such as white papers or other reference material. There are generally two options in terms of what kind of document control system you utilize for your laboratory. The first option is an electronic one. Document control can be maintained utilizing an electronic document management system. This tool houses all documents and records everything that happens to it. Additionally, often these systems will assist with tasks such as personnel review, routing for sign-off, and many other maintenance activities associated with documents and their dynamic state within the department. If no electronic system is available, document control must be maintained manually. This includes keeping a paper system to document the various aspects of document control. Generally, logs of sorts are maintained that record changes that are made to every document, including what the change was and when it was made. These logs will also include information such as dates that each document was originated, effective, revised, and then retired or archived. When policies are maintained on paper, physical signatures must be obtained for policies and procedures as changes are made. A well-designed document control program eliminates all of the file folders that are tucked away with copies of forms. In an electronic world, policies and procedures are not printed, and forms are only printed as they are needed from the electronic system. With a manual process, there should be a source of truth binder, if you will, where all current versions are housed. Files of documents should not be kept, as this is generally the source of non-current documents being used. The next topic we are going to dive into is quality improvement in the histology department. A well-rounded quality monitoring program and firmly executed proficiency testing program are critical to ensuring that the department is evolving around ways to improve. An effective quality improvement program consists of the implementation of quality monitors that focus on high-volume, problem-prone, high-risk situations or issues. The department's quality monitors should be very dynamic in the sense that as thresholds are met consistently, either the threshold should be raised or the monitor should be retired and replaced with another monitor that challenges the department in an area that could use improvement. Generally speaking, a department should have at least 5 monitors where data is collected each month and can be trended over a year's time. Generally, most departments have a lot more than 5 monitors. Annually, an assessment of the quality program should be performed with a determination made to decide if the monitor should be continued, changed, or eliminated. Quality monitors should be documented in a formal document outlining a guideline for data collection and interpretation of the results. This is basically a document that could be used for anyone to pull the data for the monitor. also to be used to ensure that the data is pulled the same way every time. Quality monitors should include formal documentation of the forms to be utilized for the monitors and the expected reporting mechanisms that are in place. An often missed element of quality monitoring is the documentation of corrective action when a monitor does not meet threshold or the trends show problems. It is imperative that as data is generated for various quality monitors, that you show documentation of corrective action. The goal of a quality monitoring program is to glean information so that steps can be taken to improve processes. Documentation of these steps is just as important, probably more so, than collecting the data itself. On this slide, I've listed a few examples of histology monitors that I have seen. There are many areas in the histology department that can be assessed. These are just a few items that are often chosen to be monitored. Proficiency testing that is conducted within the department should be overseen and carefully reviewed. As results are received, they should be reviewed for acceptability. Results that are coming in that are unacceptable should be investigated with corrective action put into place as necessary. These reviews, along with the corrective action, should be documented and filed along with the proficiency testing results that have been found unacceptable. An assessment should always be made for educational activities as well, meaning that results should be assessed and compared to the peer review group. Proficiency testing performed within the histology department should be handled with the same vigor as in the clinical laboratory. Proficiency testing outcomes can often be utilized to develop quality monitors within the department. So the last topic we are going to touch upon are the personnel qualifications for the histology department. Additionally, we are going to talk a bit about the CLIA roles and the responsibilities that are associated with those roles. So the 5 CLIA roles that apply to histology include the following: medical director, clinical consultant, technical supervisor, general supervisor, and then testing personnel. And we'll talk about each of these on the next slide. Personnel educational qualifications for the histology department are quite a bit different in terms of expectations as compared to the clinical department. Pathologists meet the requirement for the role that has been assigned to them, typically with their medical degree. Pathologists usually fulfill the clinical consultant and medical director roles for the laboratory as a whole. Additionally, there must be a pathologist assigned to the technical supervisor role for the histology department. The role of general supervisor only applies to high complexity testing. All testing within the histology department is considered highly complex. However, there are only limited testing personnel who actually perform high complexity testing according to CLIA. The histology supervisor can generally hold the general supervisor role. The general supervisor role requires at a minimum an associate's degree in medical laboratory technology or a bachelor's degree in clinical laboratory science, medical technology, or chemical, physical, or biological science. Histology technicians and histotechnologists can be considered testing personnel according to CLIA, but generally aren't, since they don't actually perform the high complexity testing because they don't actually result anything out without the pathologist's oversight. In some organizations where they do perform functions that qualify as highly complex, the employees must meet the high complexity testing educational requirements. Pathology assistants do need to meet the high complexity testing educational requirements, which require that the PA have an Associate of Science degree or a Bachelor of Science degree with a documented field of study. You need to be careful here because you must have a document where the field of study is documented as a biological, chemical, or physical science, or in the field of medical laboratory technology. There are degrees out there that are labeled as BS or AS, but their field of study is not a designated science, in which case they would not meet the requirement. Any support staff usually only need to meet the requirements as set forth by the organization, as long as the tasks they are performing are all support related. In terms of the CLIA roles and the responsibilities associated with each role, there are a few things to keep in mind for the histology department. A medical director or technical supervisor, in cases where it has been and can be formally delegated in writing, must sign off on quality documentation. A histology supervisor cannot alone sign off on these documents. For example, monthly quality control, IHC validations, etc., if they do not meet the qualifications of a technical supervisor, and it is a responsibility as determined by CLIA that a technical supervisor or medical director must perform. The qualifications of a technical supervisor for AP is different than that of the clinical departments in that the technical supervisor must hold an MD or a DO. This is why for AP, a pathologist must hold and carry out this role as compared to the clinical departments where you usually see a leader with a BS holding this role. In histology departments, you can see the histology supervisor holding the general supervisor role as defined by CLIA, but then a pathologist holds the role of the technical supervisor, and then of course the medical director usually delegates certain CLIA responsibilities to the technical supervisor to carry out. This is often a pitfall for histology departments, as they often assume that whoever holds the histology supervisor role of the department for the organization can sign off on all documents alone, and they cannot. Similarly, the fact is often overlooked that only a technical supervisor can be delegated certain responsibilities by the medical director and not the general supervisor. Since CLIA defines what responsibilities can be carried out by what role, it is important that you review these and understand what your histology supervisor can and cannot solely sign off on. In most organizations, your histology supervisor will sign off on departmental quality control, quality monitors, test validations, and competency as part of the review. However, a pathologist that fills the technical supervisor role or the medical director must sign off as well. So with that, I would like to conclude by saying that over the years, I have seen histology and the anatomic pathology field as a whole become an increasingly heavy player within the laboratory industry. The technology that is here and now and that which is on the horizon is bringing new and exciting concepts to the department in ways that have never been dealt with before. Gone are the cutting and embedding a few blocks and running a few special stains in Copeland jars and IHC in the humidity chambers. With science moving as fast as it is, the histology department is going to continue to play an integral role. And with that expectation, good quality programs are going to need to be in place to ensure success. I hope that you have found this presentation worthwhile and valuable. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at my email address indicated on this last slide. So with that, Josh, I will turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kelly. Definitely appreciate your time today. We do still have a few minutes for those people that are still on. If you take a look at the taskbar for the GoToWebinar, you'll see a little section where there is an area for questions. If you do have any questions in the next few minutes that you would like to ask Kelly before we sign off today, go ahead and click in that question box, type in your question, and I'll make sure to read that out here to Kelly. While we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, give you a few minutes, we do want to cover and go over our featured product of the month for this month. This featured product this month is our AccuEdge disposable microtome blades. Many of you are probably actually familiar with our blades. For those who are not, they're actually designed for both high and low file blade holders. They do have that ultra sharp blade edge. It ensures the uniformity and consistency in sectioning. It also allows users to obtain superior ribbon, virtually eliminating chatter, distortion, and striations. That can be a real pain when we're doing our microtomy. That dust-free blade dispenser automatically positions new blades safely and precisely to help eliminate some of those mishaps and finger cuts. And the consistent durability enables techs to cut more blocks per blade. If you do want more information about the AccuEdge disposable microtome blades, you can, of course, visit our website or also talk to your local area sales manager. And we do actually have a question that's come in. Thank you. The question, Kelly, is, can you please go over the general supervisor definition again?
Sure. I'm assuming they mean in terms of requirements. Let me see here. So from a CLIA perspective, your general supervisor is only able to oversee high complexity testing. So the general supervisor can, they can oversee moderate complexity testing as well, if that is, if you have any of that within the department. As far as the actual requirements, your general supervisor role you can have an associate's degree. I'm assuming that's what they more specifically want. It requires a minimum of an associate's degree in medical laboratory technology. I'm not sure how often that applies to histology, or a bachelor's degree in clinical laboratory science, medical technology, or chemical, physical, or biological science. So generally that's, your chemistry, physics, or your bio.
All right. We have another question. Can you give an example of what you do or use for blind samples for IHC competency?
Usually we will use the proficiency testing depending on what vendor you use for proficiency testing, we use CAP. And we have our MKs that we get from CAP. And so we will use the slides in there and give them to the techs. We'll assign a different tech each time or a different tech for each survey. And they will then use those slides and they will do then the staining before we give it to the pathologist to interpret. But then the staining that they do will be utilized for that blind sample piece.
Gotcha. All right, we have it's a non-Kelly question, but we did have the question, can we get a handout of the presentation? And the answer is actually yes. If you look at the sidebar, you can see at the bottom there's a handout section. There is a PDF handout of the presentation available. You can actually download it directly from there. So thank you for that question. And no more questions, but we do have a comment for you. It says, thanks, Kelly, very informative webinar. So a little appreciation for you there before we wrap up.
Thank you very much.
Yep, and I think that is it. Once again, Kelly, I do want to very much thank you for your time. This is an area, histology, that we often do have questions about and is not always clearly discussed. We do talk a lot about the technical side of things. So we appreciate you spending your time today. And we will wrap it up. I hope everyone stays safe and, of course, joins us again on our next webinar. If you want to look and see what's on the schedule, go ahead and go to the Sakura website at www.sakuraus.com. Go to the education area under upcoming webinars, and you can find some of our next webinars that are coming up as well. And with that, I will say thank you to everyone and have a great day. And we will hope to see you again next month.
Thank you.